Hello, and welcome to Reflecting on Truth. I'm Jim Higgins. Thanks for joining me today. I'd like to give a presentation today based on a chapter of a book I read recently. I've titled this presentation, Circle of Life, Line of Death. And I want to give credit where credit's due. I got this information from a book written by a pastor named Ty Gibson, and it's in his book, Shades of Grace. This is a remarkable book. You can find it on Amazon. It's a little more expensive. You can actually get it much cheaper if you order it from Ty Gibson's website, which is lightbearers.com. And this is from chapter 6. And it made a real impression on me because it presents God, the nature of sin and law and salvation from a really wonderful perspective that, as I've thought long and hard about it, it passes the smell test. This is a really insightful presentation. Although, to be honest, I won't do nearly as good a job as Ty does when he gives his presentations or in his writing in his book. But I wanted to share it with you nonetheless. So let's dive in. I want to ask you a question. Now, our lives are filled with questions of many types, but this is perhaps the most important question you can ever ask. Now, it may strike you as a little bit odd to give that much weight to a question, but I will say that how you answer this question will basically impact everything you do in your life. And it's so important that you spend time and think about this and don't just make easy assumptions based on what you've heard before. So what is this important question? The important question I'd like to have you ask yourself, and I ask myself, is what do you think of God? Pause for a moment and think about that. What do you think of God? Many of us have heard things from the Bible, and we may have very quick platitudinal answers that we can jump out and say, God is love, or whatever. But stop and ask yourself, what is your image, your true image of God? Now, in order to answer this question, I'd like us to go through a little thought experiment. I want you to think back in your life to the earliest memory that you can remember. What's your earliest memory? For me, my earliest memory is I'm about 2 years old, and I remember vaguely the house that we lived in, but what I remember is on this particular day, I found myself sitting on an anthill, and it was not a pleasant experience. I can remember myself crying for my mom because it hurt as I was being bitten by the ants. And of course, I couldn't save myself. I didn't realize that I should just move. So I sat there crying in pain. That's my earliest memory in my life. But go back even farther from your earliest memory in your life. What's the earliest thing you remember about your parents? Now, this obviously you're having to get information from them or your grandparents. What's the earliest memory, the fact about your parents that you can think of? Now go back farther. What about your grandparents? Probably a little bit less about them than about your parents. What about your great-grandparents? Now here, it's getting a little bit fuzzy. You don't have as much information. But let's, just as a thought experiment, let's continue back in time. Go back in your mind's eye imaginatively to the Reformation or the Renaissance. Keep going back. You pass the crucifixion. You go back farther. You go back past the Babylonian captivity, and you continue on back. You go past the Exodus, and finally you get back to the creation of the world. Go back a little bit farther, before the world was created, before the universe was created. Well, now things are pretty sketchy because we've passed back beyond the space-time continuum to the point where, for our physical, practical reckoning, there's nothing to relate to. But we know that there are still some beings there, right? Because we know there were angelic beings. There were other beings that God created. Now travel back even before the angels, before any created being, any created thing. And what do you have? When you have passed back through time before all things were created, you have God. Alone, and yet, was he? This is where our question comes into being. What is your thought of God? Who was he? What was he like? What were his motives? What was his character and personality before anything else existed? And this leads us to some fundamental truths. So he was alone, and yet he was not alone. Now, what do I mean by this? Consider what we know about God. God is holy. The Bible tells us that. He's righteous. He's a consuming fire, which is easy to imagine when you imagine a being so powerful they could speak things into existence. But God is also just, infinitely just. He is infinitely patient. He's infinite in knowledge, in presence, in all of these characteristics. But the important thing to note is, according to the Bible, all of these characteristics about God exist within one fundamental truth. And what truth am I talking about? That truth is that God is love. We find that in 1 John chapter 4, verse 8, but that's just an extrapolation of the whole Bible when it comes down to. God is love. Notice it's not God is loving. It's not an attribute of his character. God is love. Everything else about God's character flows from this concept that God is love. Now think of this. Love is only possible in reference to others or to something else. Love as a single solitary thing with nothing to love, it can't exist. It's a contradiction in terms. So this idea that God is love, it necessitates that he cannot be just a single solitary unity. Instead, God is unity, but if God is solitary, and he's in his very nature is love, he cannot be perfect. Now, what do I mean by this? Stick with me here for just a second. If God, as his fundamental characteristic, as his being is love, with nothing to love, then God by nature is imperfect. He's incomplete. Therefore, God would have to create in order to have something to love and thus be fulfilled within himself. Therefore, creation would have been a necessity that God needs us as much as we need him. And that would make for an imperfect God. But on the other hand, the Bible presents this fascinating picture of God as unity amidst diversity. And this is a key concept that I'm sure the Bible writers didn't even have any conception of, is that by presenting himself as a single being with three dynamic personalities, and I know that that's a hard thing for us mere mortals to grasp, by God having these three personalities within one entity, these three beings, for lack of a better term, that we call Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, what that allows us to conceive of is a unitary God in the very beginning of creation that is complete and fulfilled in mutual love passing between the Godhead. They're loving and being loved, and in that state, they are complete and full of joy. Which then leads us to this concept. We can answer the question as to why did God create? So God started creating beings at some point. We know that because, as a matter of fact, we happen to be here. But why did he create them? And how we see God will significantly impact the answer to our question of why did God create anything at all? And so, for example, if God is a single solitary being, a unity, for example, as Islam presents him, then he would have to create out of a selfish, somewhat motive. He has love and he needs something to love to be fulfilled. Therefore, he creates to create beings that he can interact with and interface with and have communion and therefore have mutual love and be complete. God loving and being loved. On the other hand, if God is a unity within diversity, in other words, the Christian conception of the Godhead as an example, then that means he can create from completely unselfish motives. He's complete in himself. He's full of love, and it's all mutual giving and receiving. And what he does is he creates beings solely for the purpose of sharing the enjoyment that he already has. And it's one of those interesting characteristics about true love. You'll notice if you've ever had it, is the tendency is when you have love and you share that love, you have even more love to give away. It's really kind of an amazing thing. So when God created mankind, it's interesting how the Bible chooses the terminology with which God engages in this creation enterprise. We find in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, that God says, "Let us make man in our image." And I want to emphasize two key words there. Let us make man in our image. The reference to the plural. It's not, I will make man in my image, but let us make man in our image. And notice even the nature of the communication. It's not in the form of an emphatic, we will make man in our image, but you can even sense the collaborative nature of the communication within the Godhead in the let us. Let us. It's like with your friends saying, hey, let's go to the beach. That's great. Let's make man in our image. Now, what is God's image? This is an important concept. Does God look like us? I can't pretend to make any kind of argument to say what God actually looks like. The Bible seems to indicate that he can express himself when he wants to in terms of having attributes somewhat similar to us. But I'm not one to argue that he actually looks like us in any way. He can if he wants to. Instead, I believe that since God is a relational being, he wants to create other relational beings who share the characteristics like him with having the ability to think and to do. He wants to create beings that he can relate to and share with and interact with and have intellectual intercourse with for the joy of doing it. And so in order to do that, he has to give them some sense, some essence of himself. It's less about what we look like, and it's more about who we are as beings. And so God creates the first man. And in the book of Genesis, it's interesting that God goes through this exercise where he brings all these animals before this first man, Adam, and Adam names them, which is engaging in the first act of scientific endeavors, for example, because naming is nomenclature, and that's what science is about. Adam's getting to use his brain to apply a taxonomic nomenclature to the animal kingdom. But the interesting thing is God brings these creatures before him to help Adam come to a realization that God already knew. And God says in Genesis chapter 2:18, it's not good for man to be alone. That is a profound statement because it says in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, God created man, singular, in his own image, male and female, he created them. In other words, the male aspect of humanity is not the image of God. It is the combination of male and female together that constitutes the image of God. And you can see it reflected. Just as the Godhead has a unity amidst diversity, he creates a being composed of two beings that there may also be a unity within diversity. Now, this idea of creating a relational being introduces a tremendous risk. God took a huge risk in doing that. Now, of course, he knew what was going to happen, and he made plans for the eventuality of what ultimately unfolded, but there was no other way to accomplish this idea of creating beings who shared this aspect of his image. Now, what do I mean by that? It all has to do with plural existence, right? So humanity is an us, not an I. So I exist, yes, but God designed me to live as myself in relation to an us. And so each person is an individual self, and yet is actually in a very fundamental way inseparable from others. You've heard the phrase, no man is an island. It's true. It's because our natures were designed to be plural. To be whole, we need each other. Now, here's the problem. To be simultaneously aware of myself as well as others provides me with an ever-present choice that I need to make. And this is an all-important choice on which anything hinges. I have a choice as this being created in the image of God to choose whether I will be self-centered and me-focused, or will I be other-centered, focused on giving rather than taking? Every day, every interaction with others, my thoughts, my plans, everything I do, I always face this choice. Will I choose to focus on myself and do what's good for me? Or will I be focused on others and willing to try to do what's best for them? We all face this choice every day. In other words, God gave us an amazing gift of free will. Free will. We love that idea of free will. We're free. We're freedom, liberty. But the problem is, with great freedom comes much responsibility. And so in this wonderful gift of free will, God gave us a choice of living according to the fundamental reality of the universe as he created it, or to choose to leave the intricate dance of other-centered love and live for ourselves. In other words, to live in sin. That is what our free will purchases us, a choice. Now, on your screen, you'll see an example of what I'm talking about. Notice that in the center, there is God, the unity within diversity, complete, fulfilled, perfect in love. God creates beings with whom he can share that love, and thus he expands his universe of love. And these beings then are designed as a plurality that they may also interact with each other, giving and receiving just as they can with God. So the original plan of the universe was an infinite harmony based on mutual love of giving, receiving harmony. That is the universe God designed. And within that context of free will, there was perfection. Had things gone on that way, had we exercised our free will to choose to live in accordance with the universe as God designed it, we would be living in paradise. No death, no pain, no emotional hurt, no tears, no unwanted separation. We would be completely at peace. It's amazing to conceive of. But when you and I look around at the universe, it's pretty obvious. That's not the universe I'm living in. And so we have to ask ourselves, what exactly happened? If God created a perfect universe, how did it go so bad? Now, there are a lot of people, there are scientists and skeptics who will very casually say, well, if God created a universe like this, he sure didn't know what he was doing, or he did poor workmanship. That's a real casual explanation for things, because you have to ask yourself, is the universe we're living in the universe God designed? Or had he designed something different? But in that design, there was the opportunity for something to go wrong. How you answer that is everything. Just like I said at that fundamental question, what do you think of God? So we have to ask ourselves, what is the nature of reality? And what is this problem of sin that many of us hear so much about? Well, again, just as a recap, the universe was designed to operate according to God's character, law of love. In other words, you could say that his laws for the universe were love, and his love was law. It's kind of like an equation. His law equals love equals law, and altogether that equals life. When you're living in harmony with the universe as God designed it, it is compatible with life. Now, we learn in Matthew chapter 22, verse 40, that this is in fact the case. Now, you may recall, someone comes to Jesus and asks him, Master, what's the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus, quoting the Old Testament, says, love the Lord your God with all your soul, all your strength, all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Upon these two laws hang all the law and the prophets. In other words, everything written about God, every law that he established, everything is based on this foundation of love. With the ideal of being that when people live according to this law, they will live in mutual love for one another and mutual love with God. And that is the source of life, when you're in harmony with the universe as the way it was designed. So this law of love is simply the way nature works. It's the reality as it was designed. And we know from the physical world, when you step outside of the way the physical world was designed, bad things happen to us. If I stand on the top of a building and I laugh at gravity and step off, well, I'm going to come to a rapid end, or I'm going to break something and be in terrible pain. If I decide to hold my head underwater for an hour and just say, I can breathe, I can do fine, I'm going to die. If you step outside of the world as it's designed, it's not compatible with life. But on a very more fundamental level, the way God designed the universe to operate is actually the underpinnings of life. It's the nature of reality. So when you step outside of this nature as God designed it, bad things happened. Anything outside of that law of love leads to death. And so then there was sin. Now, for those of you, if you're a Christian, we talk about sin a lot. And so I asked the question, what is sin? Well, the Bible will say, well, sin is the transgression of the law. Well, which law? We know that the law foundationally is really about love. So sin is a violation of love. But many of us, when we think of transgression of the law, we think on the outward behavioral level. Like we look at the 10 Commandments, and the 10 Commandments basically will say, you know, don't commit adultery, don't commit murder, don't steal, don't lie. With respect to God, don't have any image, don't take His name in vain, don't worship any idols or images. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. All of these kinds of things, and we tend to like extrapolate from that to external behaviors. We think that sin is behavior, and sin is not behavior. The behaviors that we engage in are simply a symptom of the internal state of our heart. If you think about it, living outside of the law of love, which is life, it means that every single time we sin, what we're actually doing is we're violating love. Think about, for example, going back to the 10 Commandments. Think about stealing. Every time you steal, you are doing something to gain for yourself at the expense of others. It's a violation of love. If you commit adultery, what you're doing is you're doing something that feels good for you and gives you pleasure and fulfills your need at the tremendous cost for one or more others. If you lie to protect yourself, to build yourself up, and you're doing it at the cost of others. It's a violation of love. And the same thing goes with God, the source of all life and light. If you put any God before Him, you're following your own way and negating the fact of the one who gave you everything. It's a violation of love. If you don't remember the Sabbath day, many people today, they don't take the Sabbath day all that seriously, but the fact of the matter is God said, do this. And He says, do it because it's a way to remember that I am the Lord that sanctifies you. I am your God. I created the world. And so when people negate these things, sin, think of any sin you want to think of, and you'll see that at root, it's a violation of this law of love. And this law that of sin is every bit as real as what we see as these tangible laws in the universe around you. So the results of sin, in other words, are simply cause and effect. What do I mean by that? Well, we know in the Bible says the wages of sin are death. Many people, when they read that, they interpret it like this: God saying, if you sin, I'll kill you. Or if you sin, I'll punish you. Or if you sin, it makes me very, very angry. And therefore, the wages of sin are death. Now, the thing to keep in mind, though, is when you talk about wages, wages are something you earn. And basically what it says when the wages of sin are death, it's sin, and the natural pay for sin is death. What do I mean by that? Take a look at Galatians chapter 6, verse 7 and 8 in the New Testament, where Paul writes, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. I want to pause for a second. Notice the cause and effect. You reap what you sow. If you plant potatoes, you don't expect to get carrots. You reap what you sow. Continuing. Whoever sows to please their flesh will reap destruction. Notice it's a follow-on. It's a cause effect. Whoever sows to the Spirit will reap eternal life. It's important to note the cause and effect nature of sin and death. Let's look at another text. Look at Romans, another book by Paul, chapter 8, verse 6. The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. Notice again, there's a relationship that the Bible is expressing here between sin and death. Let's look at another one. Romans chapter 8, verse 13, another Paul, it's still in the same book by Paul. If you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the misdeeds of the body, you will live. Notice, live according to the flesh, you die. It's just the nature of things. Let's look at another one. If you look at James chapter 1, verse 15, you get, after desire has conceived. In other words, it comes from our heart. We desire to glorify ourselves or serve ourselves. When our desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Notice the cause and effect relationship here. It's so important that we understand this, that the death of the wicked is not really God's doing. It's the fact that when we sin, the natural cause-effect relationship is death. So the results of sin, like I say, are simply cause and effect. Take a look at Proverbs chapter 8, verse 36. Those who fail to find me, this is referring to wisdom. Solomon is referring to wisdom, but wisdom is sort of juxtaposed with God. It's the same thing as God. Those who fail to find me harm themselves. All who hate me love death. Now, here's an example of what we're talking about. Now, notice you'll see on your screen the original circle of God in the middle, engaging with giving and receiving of love from those he created, and those he created interacting with one another in mutual loving, giving, receiving, this whole harmonious universe as it was designed. But the Bible presents that Adam and Eve chose to remove themselves from that circle of life. And as soon as they did that, they took off on a different trajectory that Ty Gibson calls the line of death. Now, there's a law in physics. There's a physical law that goes like this. The vector motion of a closed system, when isolated from external forces, remains constant. Now, what that's really saying is that if something takes off on its own, and unless it's impacted by external forces, that it'll just keep going in the same direction. And the story that the Bible presents is that Adam and Eve took off on their own. They separated themselves from the very source of life. And as soon as they did that, as soon as they broke the connection within that circle of love and life, they ended up taking off on a trajectory that left to themselves, there's no recovering from. And the important thing is since God is the source of life, when you separate yourself from the source of life, it's like unplugging a lamp from the wall. It goes out. Now, God had warned Adam and Eve, in the day that you take this step, if you take it, you will die. So why didn't Adam and Eve just simply drop dead when they broke this covenant? It has a lot to do with the amazing nature of God, because God loves them. And it's a remarkable thing when you look at how God interacts with Adam and Eve after they fell. You'll see that of course God knows everything they've done, and yet God goes to the garden to interact with them. And he calls out to them, and they're hiding as if he doesn't know where they are. Now, he could have said, get out from behind that bush. I know exactly what you did, and you're going to pay. But they're afraid of him. And why are they afraid of him? Because their consciences have told them that they have done something terrible. They have believed a lie about God, which led them to think that they could go another way. I won't go too into detail on that, but the remarkable thing in the story is that God, he's so gentle when you hear his voice. I mean, when he's like, where are you? And Adam's like, We were afraid. Come on out here. Come on. And they come out because God's reassuring and God knows what they did. And then he's like, well, why were you afraid? Oh, we were naked and all this. Well, who told you that? God knows all this, right? He's trying to help win them back, but they're damaged. There's something that has happened in their psyche where they've believed wholeheartedly a lie about God, that he was keeping something from them and that they could be better if they went off on their own. And so rather than die, God extended his grace to them, totally undeserved on their part, but totally in the nature of God for who he is, so that in the end, he protected them that they did not die immediately, but rather he gave them enough time that he could work with them, which is why all of us are still here, because he's continuing to work with us. God wasn't content, because he's love, to let any part of his creation just implode and die like that. He built us for relationship. And so we find in the whole Bible that God had a plan to fix this thing. So why are the wages of sin death then? It's not because God needs to be appeased. It's not that. And it's not because God must arbitrarily destroy sin. It's not that. See, people often think of there's God and then there's his law, and that if you don't obey his law and you don't live up to his law somehow, that's when you don't get to go to the good place. That's called sin. But it's not that God must arbitrarily destroy sin, because sin is not arbitrary. God's law is not simply an arbitrary set of requirements. His law is based on love, and it's the only way for people to live together in mutual giving and receiving love. When you step outside of God's law, you no longer have a place in the universe, because that's not how the universe is designed to operate. So God hates sin. But why? For this simple reason: sin harms the sinner and sin harms others. God hates that. He cannot abide with self-destructive behavior. When you love someone, if you love someone and they slip into drugs and they're destroying your life, do you just like, hey, have fun? No, it tears you apart inside. When you see someone engaging in terribly self-destructive behaviors, they're spiraling out of control, do you just sit there casually and like, well, everyone's got free will. I mean, they can choose what they want. If you really love them, you're desperate to find a way to help them. And that's kind of the position God was in. When we chose to rebel, he wanted to fix it. He hates sin because sin harms others. And the natural effect of sin is death. And God hates that. He hates death. It's interesting, if you look at C.S. Lewis in his book, Mere Christianity, he describes the situation of the final end when God basically steps onto the stage and the play is over. C.S. Lewis says, in the end, there are only two kinds of people: those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, thy will be done. We as a race have chosen death. God has made a way for life in Jesus Christ. But he leaves the final choice to us. I really like the verse in Ezekiel chapter 33, verse 11, where God says, say to them, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and live. Now listen to the longing in his voice. Turn from your evil ways. For why will you die? Why would you choose to die? And yet so many people choose to do that. Now imagine this image of God that is portrayed here. It's totally scriptural, but it's an image of God that most people don't have. They see God as the punisher of sin, the punisher of transgressions, as an angry God who needed to be appeased by having his son die on the cross. No. Everything God has done is an act of love to try to help those whom he loved. I want to give another final example before I close this. This is from a different chapter in Ty Gibson's book, Shades of Grace. He tells the story of a time when he and his wife, they're away on some trip. Now, he had purchased a car, his very first new car. For any of you who have bought a new car, and especially when it was your first new car, you know what that's like. It's exciting. He describes it that he did all this research, he looked at all the options, considered the various models, and finally he settled on a car. And he bought this car and he was just so happy with it. So he and his wife, they go on this trip, and while they're away, their neighbor, the teenage neighbor, decided that it might be a good time to take this car for a drive. This teenager didn't have a license, and this teenager invited a young lady to come with him on this drive. And so they took Ty's car for a drive. This car that he still owed a substantial amount of money on. This car that he loved. And you know what happened. The car had an unfortunate encounter with a tree. And what was discovered is that the tree is pretty unmovable. And about the only thing that happened to the tree was some bark was knocked off. But the car was totaled. And so Ty gets a call from one of his neighbors and said, "Hey man, I want you to know that the neighbor kid took your car for a drive and they ran it into a tree and it's totaled." Luckily, neither the teenager nor the young lady were injured severely, but the car was totaled. What would you do if you were Ty? I think to myself, the first thing I would want to do is throttle the kid and say, "You should have died in the crash." And that's probably what Ty's feelings were initially as well. But Ty goes on to say that he talked it over with his wife, and at first it was like, "Well, buddy, you pay to play, get a job and start paying me back." But they realized that this young man could never pay them back. He's in school. He has no job. He literally does not have the resources to pay them back without ruining his life. And so that presented Ty and his wife with a problem. You see, they loved this teenager. They really cared for him. And they didn't want to see harm come to him. And yet, he had done something terrible and violated a trust, and he absolutely deserved to be punished and to pay the price that was due for his error. And yet, he couldn't pay the price. And so Ty and his wife, they thought, well, he can't bear this burden to replace the car. But we can, somehow. And so they made a determination what they were going to do. And so they went home, and about a few days later, they get this shy knock on the door. They open the door, and who is it but the teenager? Downcast eyes and, shuffling his feet. And he's like, "Well, I guess I ruined your car." Ty said, "Yeah, I've heard that." And he's like, "I'm really sorry. I'm gonna pay you back. I'm gonna quit school. I'm gonna get a job at the lumber mill or someplace, and I'll pay you back." And so Ty brought this young kid in the house, sat him down on the couch. He's looking down, and Ty and his wife said, "You don't owe us anything. We give you the car." And he looked up and he's like, "No way." He's like, "Yes, you can't afford this. We can. You're to stay in school and you're to get on with your life as if this never happened. You are forgiven." I love that story because it's so much like the situation with us and with God. We violated a trust that God gave us. He gave us as a race a world, literally a universe, and eternal life, and everything we could possibly want. And we traded it all of it, for a quick attempt at godhood ourselves. And he knew we couldn't make it right. We don't have the resources, but God does. And the whole story of the scriptures and the whole story of the plan of salvation is this infinitely loving God, this all-powerful being, who rather than try to force us into submission, he took on the burden himself. In a moral universe, something had to be done. He couldn't just wink at us going off on our own. We would destroy ourselves. And so the only way to bring us back into unity with himself is exactly what he did through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Ty finishes the story by saying, sometime later, the kid grew up, he got his driver's license, and he became a very careful driver. And one day, Ty was at the neighbor's house, and the young man comes in and he asks his mom if he could borrow her car because he had an appointment. And she's like, so sorry, sweetie, I can't do it this time. I have an appointment myself. And Ty says he took out his keys and he dangled them and said, here, take my car. And the young man's like, no way, I'm never driving your car. And Ty's like, come on, you need it, I'll let you use it. And so this young man goes out and he gets in the car, and Ty said, I have never seen anyone back out of the driveway with the emergency flashers on. He was so careful. And as he drove away at like 10 miles an hour, he would hit the brakes every so often. He's like, I don't know how he's driving now, but he was super careful with my car there. So anyway, it's food for thought. I hope that this little talk gives you some insight into just how amazing God is. He's not vengeful. He's not an angry God, except for the fact that it hurts him deeply when we hurt ourselves and we hurt others. And he doesn't want to let us go. Like he said in Ezekiel, turn, for why will you die? So what's your choice today? Are you going to choose to get to know this God better? Are you going to choose to rid yourself of lies that you've heard about him and instead turn toward the light, its freedom, its gratitude, its love, and its wonder? Thank you for watching. I'm Jim Higgins, and this has been Reflecting on Truth. If you enjoyed this presentation, I'd encourage you to click on the subscribe button and maybe the little bell, the notification button. Maybe make a comment. Tell me what you think of this. It certainly helps YouTube identify and share these with others. And subscribing to my channel lets me know that you find this content valuable. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you watching, and I hope you have a lovely day.